Let's talk about your proposal for sort of fixing capitalism. So I obviously am a very laissez-faire, free market-oriented guy. You have proposed something called anthropic capitalism. So what exactly does that term mean? And what does that mean in material terms and in terms of policy?
Well, the short answer is that we don't know and that we better come up with an answer quickly. What if capitalism was a pretty terrific solution for the 19th and 20th centuries, but that in the era of, let's say, machine learning and robots and world labor markets, that if you actually just let the machine run, it doesn't deliver enough stability in fact, jobs may go away because while opportunity may be plentiful, stable, repetitive activity that's lucrative may be, in fact, quite scarce. It's not at all clear to me that if you let the wheels of capitalism run in the current era, that markets will clear in a way that we're happy with the way in which our resources are distributed. Many people may become very disenchanted. And these are souls that need purpose, they need sustenance, and they need activity with dignity that the market may have provided very well in the past. So we're not going to disagree with you about the past. What I'm worried about is the future. And I think this is one of these paradoxes where conservatives tend to be very right about the past, and progressives, if they are right, tend to be right about the fact that things may need to be very different on a going forward basis.
Well, it'll be interesting to see as far as, I mean, there have been people on the right, including Charles Murray and Milton Friedman, who've proposed some form of universal basic income as a solution to the rise of artificial intelligence and the fact that you are having a lower skilled population that is just not going to be able to compete in this market where machines take over all the truck driving, for example, and all of the repetitive labor has been taken over by
radiology may be now low skill compared to a machine.
I mean, that's true too, although I think that the diagnosis seems to be better, at least from what I can see. Diagnosis seems to be better when it's a combination of machine learning and human input.
Fair enough, but I'm just trying to say that what
we define as low skilled is gradually inching upward.
Can change quite a bit.
Right.
Yeah, I think that the fact is that we all acknowledge that it has to be some kind of a hybridized system. But what I think is also true, and this is good news for you, is that those few people who can actually manage these incredibly complicated enterprises to deliver really profound innovation and growth may need to be freed from burdensome regulation that's completely inappropriate to creating new sectors of the economy. At the same time, if those windfalls occur, we may need radical ways of redistributing some of that if, in fact, jobs are affected in some new way where instead of machines having traditionally chased us from repetitive behavior of low value to repetitive behavior of higher value, the new paradigm may be that all repetitive behavior is not lucrative, and that the reason that the huge windfalls occur is that those people
there'll be an actual IQ hierarchy, essentially.
Well, it's not just IQ hierarchy. It may be that what's going on is that these are one-off special situations. And so if there are always some guys that and it's not clear that they have a job. They just sort of meet people and they sign pieces of paper and they make tremendous amounts of money. What are they doing? They're opportunistically searching the landscape for things that are not repeatable, but that actually are very well compensated. Most people are not going to be in a position to do that. And I think it's very important to actually get hyper-capitalistic because we have to deregulate certain sectors in order to get the innovation. And it's also important to realize that we're going to have to do something sort of hyper-socialistic because of what you were saying. And if the Milton Friedmans of the world have understood that, one of the things that's most meaningful to me about these conversations is if we get hyper-specific about what these alterations are, then perhaps we can get the conservatives to stop worrying quite so much about the kind of envy-driven desire to tax, where we want to punish success because it's not fair that certain people are doing so much better. And the conservatives can come back and say, you know what, we do have a nation of souls, and it's not good enough to just say, well, the market metes out harsh justice, so suck it tough. Right?
Well, this is why I think that the idea for a lot of conservatives, particularly religious conservatives, is that there always has to be a balance between liberty and virtue, that you have to have freedom in the markets, but that can't exist unless you actually have a social fabric that's fostered by, if somebody at my synagogue needs a hand, then that person gets a hand. And that's always the way that it's been in religious communities particularly. One of the great tragedies, in my view, of government growing beyond its boundaries is that people have stopped giving as much. People have stopped relying on their local community or their family as much. You see this particularly with Social Security, where people have stopped relying on, the idea was you had a lot of kids because your kids were going to support you when you got old, and that your kids knew that going in. And now I'm supporting your mother through Social Security because she paid $50 in and now she's getting $2,000 a month out. And so the idea of you saving until you're really old and making plans for that, savings rates have gone down. People have stopped worrying about it because the government's going to take care of it. And it creates all of these not only inefficiencies, but perverse incentives that result in a lot of worse outcomes. But there's another element here that I think is worth discussing, and that is, let's say that one of the things that's happening technologically is we are coming closer and closer to sort of the Star Trek replicator, where we've got a machine that just makes anything. Right? Like it's easier to buy cheap things now than it ever has been in human history. Most people can buy those things in the United States of America. The number of people who are in extreme poverty by any global standard in the United States is below 2%. The vast majority of people in the United States by global standards are upper class and above, middle to upper class and above by global standards, not American standards, by global standards. And so we're reaching the point where prosperity, at least in any sort of absolute sense historically, has grown to magnificent proportions. I mean, the person who's middle class now is living better than the person who was unbelievably wealthy in 1880 who's still going outside to pee.
By material standards.
By material standards. But this is the real problem, is that UBI doesn't solve the biggest problem of all, I think, which is, you sort of mentioned it, but the need for human fulfillment is not going to be filled by a government check or by a redistribution of income. And people, so far we filled that, for most of human history, we filled that with work. That the idea was that we don't have a lot to do today, but we have to go and we have to work because otherwise we're going to starve. And that's what fills our days. What fills our days is that we go and sure, I'm doing a repetitive task at the factory, but that's what earns me the money so I can come home and take care of my kids and make a better life for them.
And let's expand that slightly to not only include work for money, but also kin work, particularly, which has been the province more of women than of men, which has been a vital part of work, which needs to be recognized, often happens off market. But
no, that's exactly right.
Right,
One of the things that's happening is, in the materialist, almost Marxist perspective of whatever's in your bank account is your measure of value, and that's why, if you don't have enough in your bank account, then obviously the system has somehow screwed you. The reality is that we are concerned with these systemic problems, and we should focus on these systemic problems, but the great majority of unhappiness, I think, that's occurring in modern American society, and I think in the West particularly, which is historically prosperous, is a poverty of values, a poverty of meaning, a poverty of purpose, and I'm not sure that can be filled. People are trying to fill that with political action. Instead of trying to look at their own lives and say, what can I do to make myself better? And if I were on a desert island, what would I do to make myself a better person? Just me and my family, what would I do? Other than going and chopping down trees or grabbing a coconut. We're so focused on either how we rail against the system, which sometimes deserves railing against, but we spend all of our time worrying about how to rail against the system. And that, I think, makes us susceptible to politicians who lie to us about these very simplistic
Well, I agree
situations.
with that, Ben, but I also think that one of the things that we have to do a better job on is, just as I have to defend, coming from a left of center perspective, the right of people who have contributed extraordinary levels to all of us to retain extraordinary reward. I think it's hyper important for the right to acknowledge that a lot of the reward that has occurred has come from non-productive activities through rent seeking. So if some meeting takes place in an investment bank, which allows them to privatize gains and socialize whatever security is necessary to keep those banks afloat, and I wasn't party to that, that's going to make me livid and furious when it reorders the social order.
No, we fully agree on this. I mean, when it comes to this is
why we have to model this.
Well, the Tea Party and the Occupy were on the same side of this particular battle. Our problem with Occupy, I was a Tea Partier. Our problem with Occupy was not their argument that the big banks were in bed with the government. It's, why are you protesting at the big banks? Go protest at the government, right? The big banks are not elected. At least the people in the government are elected. You want to shatter that paradigm, you're actually going to have to go after elected officials as opposed to yelling at bankers who don't give a crap as they drive away in their Mercedes.
Yeah, I'm actually more upset about the people who, both left and right, refuse to talk about the problem of rent seeking. So I believe there was a speech that Hillary Clinton gave at some point, if I'm not mistaken, where she said, come on, we all created the great financial crisis. And I thought, no, we really didn't all create the great financial crisis. And whether that is the heads of investment banks or politicians or the rating agencies, whatever it is, we did not return costs in an appropriate fashion. And that is the problem why there's such a loss of trust. When we had the savings and loan scandal, when you have situations where people go to jail, when people do jail time for bad deeds, you have a public trust that people can see that the high and mighty can be laid low. What was astounding, and this is one of the things where I learned to distrust the New York Times, is I appeared in an article called "They Tried to Outsmart Wall Street," which tried to make the case that it was not the investment bankers, but the quants who came from mathematics and physics who caused the crisis. When from my perspective, we were the guys who tried to sound the alarm and say, hey, the models are out of control and this is nuts, and nobody listened to us. So it's very important to realize that the media gets into the act, the regulators, the ratings agencies, the politicians. There's this entire industry of people that ordinary Americans do not understand, cannot fathom, that is allowing rent-seeking to undermine the basis of wealth. And it's important that wealth be something we can understand. I always watch Jackie Chan when he does a reel of the stunts in his film that didn't go well, and he slides down, live electrical wire and breaks through glass. And I think there's no way in the world I want to tax this guy at a high level and take his money, because I know exactly why he got paid, because I would never do anything like that. I want to be able to point to fortunes and say, I know what this person created, and thank you. And it's very important that we restore confidence that rent-seeking is not the primary modality by which wealth is created through transfer.